My name is Louise, and I'll be turning 34 this year. After college, I landed a job at a prominent corporation that is well known to almost everyone. The company offered a competitive salary even for entry-level positions, but the high pay came with its own set of challenges. I found myself traveling frequently for business or training, often working overtime and during holidays. It was demanding, but I felt a deep sense of fulfillment in my role. By the time I was 28, I had been promoted to department head, a rapid advancement, especially for a woman. 4 years ago, I married Brian, who had been my boyfriend for 2 years. We were introduced through a mutual friend who was concerned about my single life and thought we'd be a good match. Initially, I wasn't interested in dating or marriage. I had always envisioned a single life, and the idea of tying the knot seemed far-fetched. Brian, however, was quite clear from the beginning. He said, "I want to get married soon and have kids. Raising them when we're older will be tougher, don't you think?" I wasn't keen on having children and found the idea of marriage rather absurd, especially since we didn't know each other well. With a new promotion and a busy schedule, marriage and starting a family seemed out of the question. Whenever Brian brought up marriage, I would gently deflect, saying, "You're rushing things. We need to get to know each other better. Marriage involves more than just the two of us." Brian proposed, "All right, let's date for 2 years and then get married. By then, we'll know each other well enough, won't we?" At the time, I doubted we'd make it through 2 years, but surprisingly, we did, and we married. Throughout our relationship, Brian was faithful, responsible, and genuinely kind. He was dedicated to his work, although his considerable ego was a constant source of irritation. He would complain at home about criticism from his superiors, saying things like, "I did it because I thought it was best, but they act so bossy. I don't need to be told what to do." It was evident that he was being called out for his mistakes, yet he seemed unable to handle criticism, whether from a superior or elsewhere. When we decided to have a dinner to introduce both families, Brian chose a restaurant that charged over $200 per person and asked me to cover half of the cost. Given the extravagant price, I suggested a more affordable option, but Brian insisted, "This is important. If I choose a cheaper place, they'll think I'm stingy and won't take me seriously." I thought he should cover the expense himself if it was so crucial, but he responded, "I can't afford to pay for 8 people with my salary, maybe just 3. So could you cover the remaining 5? This meant I ended up paying more than half of the total bill. We had 4 people from each family, making a total of 8, yet Brian proposed a venue that he couldn't even fully afford for his own family. I wasn't thrilled about his choice, but when he told everyone at the dinner, "Don't worry about the bill today, I'll take care of it," I chose to stay silent despite my frustration. Everyone seemed pleased, and I figured it was best to let him handle the situation, even if it meant swallowing my concerns. In retrospect, I regret not reconsidering our marriage. Brian's behavior changed drastically after we got married. He began addressing me in a condescending manner and stopped being the supportive partner he once was. Before marriage, he had promised to help with household chores, but once we were married, his attitude shifted. He would say things like, "What will the neighbors think if they see a man hanging out laundry? Besides, household chores are a woman's responsibility. I'm working hard outside, so I deserve to relax at home." Despite my busy schedule, he never lifted a finger to help. Does he really believe that people would be shocked to see a man doing laundry? I was growing increasingly frustrated with Brian's domineering attitude, but I managed to tolerate it because I didn't mind doing the housework. What truly upset me, however, was Brian's financial support for his parents. Although his parents were farmers, they had always struggled financially, and now, nearing their 70s, farming had become even more challenging for them. They frequently called Brian, asking for money. Initially, I sympathized with their situation, but within 6 months of our marriage, Brian began giving his entire salary to his parents, leaving nothing for our living expenses. I confronted him, saying, "This is too much. It's unreasonable for me to cover all the living expenses with my salary alone." Brian responded, "How can you say that when my family is in trouble? They're your family too. Besides, you earn more than I do, so you should be able to manage." He refused to listen to my concerns. On the phone with his parents, Brian would reassure them, "Don't worry, I'm taking care of everything with my salary. I won't let her complain about it." It seemed like he was only sending a portion of his salary, but in reality, he was giving them every cent. With no money left for himself, he started asking me for pocket money, saying, "Can you give me about $200? I can barely afford lunch." I finally decided I couldn't continue like this and suggested, let's set a monthly limit on the amount we send to your parents. You need to find a way to cover your own lunch expenses. Brian agreed, saying, got it. We'll do that. Yet he continued to send his entire salary to his parents each month. This was one issue I simply couldn't endure any longer. One day, I had to be away from home for about 2 weeks on a business trip. Brian texted me, 2 weeks. What am I going to eat? And what about my laundry? Despite knowing my job required frequent travel, his message felt childish and unreasonable. I replied, figure it out yourself. You're a grown man. If you can't manage, why don't you go back to your parents' house while I'm away? Reluctantly, Brian agreed. When I returned home 2 weeks later, I was surprised to find Brian's sister, Elizabeth, at our place. We hadn't seen her since our wedding, and I wondered if something was wrong. Elizabeth greeted me with a cheerful, albeit puzzling, smile and said, hi, Louise. It's been a while. Oh, and the money? Confused, I asked, money? What are you talking about? Without hesitation, Elizabeth responded, oh, Brian mentioned that since you have savings, you'd be providing the startup capital for my business. He said not to worry because you have at least $1 million. I was completely baffled. Just then, Brian walked in carrying my passbook and seal. Seeing my reaction, he said, welcome back. Perfect timing. I'm giving your savings to Elizabeth. You know Elizabeth, right? She's a nail artist who's always dreamed of opening her own shop. She's been saving up, but she's still about $1 million short. I remember your savings from before we got married are exactly $1 million, so I told her she could have it. He handed the passbook and sealed it to Elizabeth with a smile, saying, you're lucky. This will make your dream come true. Be grateful, okay? I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I snapped, what are you talking about? That's my money. Why are you making this decision on your own? I'd understand if you wanted to lend it, but we'd need a promissory note and a repayment plan. But to just give away someone else's savings without any of that, what are you thinking? I reclaimed the passbook and seal from Elizabeth. Brian looked at me with annoyance and said, what's the big deal? We're family, aren't we? It's absurd to write a promissory note for family members. Besides, we're not lending it, we're giving it. You don't even have any hobbies because you're always working. It's a waste to just keep the money. Elizabeth has a dream. Isn't it better to use it to help her achieve that? His glare made it clear he wasn't open to discussion. Realizing this conversation was going nowhere, I thought it was pointless to argue further. But then Brian said, this money is too good for you. You just waste it. You can work and save up again. Understand? If you still want to argue, we'll get a divorce. Seeing an opportunity, an idea sparked in my mind. I quickly replied, all right, let's get a divorce. I'll draft the papers and send them to you. I'll collect my belongings soon. Until the divorce is finalized, I'll stay in a hotel. Goodbye for now. With that, I grabbed my luggage from my business trip and left the house in a hurry. Brian was stunned by my sudden decision. After a while, he sent several texts saying things like, you can still come back if you apologize now, and Elizabeth says she'll forgive you if you give her the money. Stop being stubborn and come back. I ignored all his messages. Who does he think he is? The next day, I went to the city hall and mailed the signed divorce papers back home. Despite this, he continued texting me, asking, are you really sure about this? I simply replied, please submit them as soon as possible, and ignored the rest of his texts. The divorce was finalized sooner than I had anticipated. A week later, I coordinated my move to a new house while Brian was at work. When Brian inquired about the property division, he texted, I'm glad to be rid of an ugly woman like you. We're strangers now. Make sure you divide the property properly since we're divorced. I left most of the furniture and appliances behind and deposited half of the small savings I had accumulated during our marriage into his bank account. That night, my phone was flooded with calls from Brian. At first, I ignored them, thinking, here we go again. But soon I began receiving calls from Elizabeth as well. Finally, I answered, and Brian yelled, hey, what's the deal with the property division? This is ridiculous. There's only $800 in this account. I thought to myself, just as I expected. I told Brian, see, I did split the property. We originally had $1,600 in our joint account, so I left you with half, $800. All the furniture and appliances were purchased after our marriage, so I left them behind. That seems like a fair division, doesn't it? To be clear, I ended up with less. Brian was unconvinced. What are you talking about? You're supposed to have $1 million in savings, right? So half of that, $500,000, should be mine. Plus, you have that inheritance from your grandpa. That should be divided too. I was taken aback and couldn't help but laugh. I had anticipated this. Otherwise, I doubt Brian would have agreed to the divorce so easily. I managed to suppress my laughter and explained, "Listen, Brian, property division only involves marital assets. My savings from before we were married and my inheritance don't count as marital assets. I consulted a lawyer and divided our marital assets properly. The money we saved after getting married was all earned by me. You never contributed to our household expenses. Be grateful I'd even divided that." Brian shouted, "You're lying. There's no way that's true. You can't fool me. Hand over what's rightfully mine, or I'll sue you." His voice trembled with desperation, but I remained calm. "Go ahead. Sue me if you want. I hadn't deceived you, and the property division was fair. I'm not afraid of legal action." Hearing this, Brian quickly changed his tune. "Wait, let's forget about the divorce. I was wrong. Come back to me." He completely backpedaled and begged for reconciliation. I replied firmly, "What are you talking about? The divorce is final, and I have no intention of coming back. This isn't a joke." I added, "Since this is the end, let me be clear. If you continue living there, you'll need to cover the rent yourself. It's about $1,800 a month. You probably didn't realize because you've never paid it before." Brian responded weakly, "I can't afford that." I shrugged. If he couldn't pay, it wasn't my concern anymore. After our separation, Brian had to move back to his parents' house because he couldn't manage the rent. Struggling with moving expenses, he ended up selling the furniture and appliances I had left behind. His parents, believing he was doing well financially and hoping he would improve their situation, welcomed him with open arms. However, Brian couldn't contribute as much money as he did when we were together, and he seemed increasingly uncomfortable living with them. Elizabeth, who had been reassured by Brian that money was no concern and had started preparing to launch her own business, found herself in a difficult spot. Without access to my savings, her startup plans were put on hold. She faced significant setbacks and frustrations as she had to cancel the preparations she'd made. Brian, in turn, faced Elizabeth's anger and disappointment. But that was no longer my concern. I'm currently focused on my work and enjoying living alone. I've had my fill of marriage and have no intention of rekindling things with Brian. He still sends messages asking to get back together, but I ignore them completely. It's somewhat amusing to get updates on his situation now and then, but I'm planning to block him soon.